Hello, and thank you for joining us. We are today speaking in our Practice Across the Pond mini-series, focusing on issues that are relevant to UK and US professional services firms. I'm delighted to be joined by a really fantastic panel of speakers today, and I'd like to invite each of them to introduce themselves today. Coming first to you, Devika.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I'm Devika Kewalramani. I'm a partner and general counsel at FisherBroyles.
Thanks so much. Steve?
Hi, my name is Steve Lueker. I'm a partner at the law firm of Moses and Singer, focusing primarily on taxation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. And last but not least, Zulon.
Hi, Corinne. I'm Zulon Begum. I'm a partner at C. Murray and I specialise in non-contentious partnership work.
Today's focus is going to be on issues that are relevant to US and UK professional services firms, particularly looking at structure and matters, or everything relating to international structure and key considerations when designing structures and how structures work in practice. And I wondered, Zulon, if I might come to you first and just ask you to comment briefly on some of the key considerations when firms are considering what structure they should have, what should work, what will be put them in a good place for embarking on international transactions, particularly with the potential US combination in mind.
Yeah, so there'll be a lot of things for firms to consider when they're thinking about planting flags in different jurisdictions. You know, it will always go back to what is their objective, what is their strategy, and everything else will flow from that as to what exactly they're trying to achieve in each jurisdiction that they're trying to establish an office in or combine with. In addition to that, the other key considerations will be around tax, and that can be very complicated based on which jurisdictions you're looking to get to, and also regulation. There are different regulations, obviously, in different jurisdictions. There will be restrictions in some jurisdictions around whether foreign lawyers or foreign firms are allowed to own interest in the local law firms or are allowed to share profits in those law firms, and that can be quite tricky to manage. Law firms will be very conscious about potential liability between different offices and different entities within their structure, and they'll be concerned to put in a structure globally that ensures that liability risk is ring-fenced, ideally within each jurisdiction. So when you're bearing all those considerations in mind, there are different options on the table, and not every option will tick all of those kind of issues off. There'll be varying degrees of how each of those issues are dealt with in each different structure. And there's a kind of spectrum between fully integrated offices and law firm globally and the non-integrated options as well. So if we start with the least integrated options on the table, that will be something like a contractual association. So entering into a contract with a different firm in another jurisdiction, and that contract will normally include things as to how you deal with referrals, whether there might be referral fees involved, and how you manage that relationship. So it's more of a loose association governed by contract. And some of those associations can be much more formal. So you get the formal networks like Lex Mundi, for example, and they can be exclusive or non-exclusive referral arrangements. So there are different kind of arrangements in those kind of contractual networks. And then you get to a little bit of a greater integration. So you come to a kind of entity-based network structure. And a lot of people will be familiar with Swiss Vereins, because there are quite a few globally recognized law firms who are arranged as Swiss Vereins. The basic structure is that they use an entity like a Swiss Verein, commonly. It's becoming increasingly common also to use different entities like the limited company by guarantee, which is an English company. But the basic kind of idea is that Swiss Verein, or the English limited company by guarantee, acts as the governance entity of the whole global firm, and effectively is an umbrella. And that umbrella entity effectively sets the rules of effectively what is a club. Different Swiss Verein or limited company by guarantee structures will have different levels of integration. There'll be some that are least integrated, so effectively kind of a franchise model where they effectively only kind of share the name and the branding and maybe some marketing and business development. And others will be far more integrated. So they'll have a degree of profit pooling. There'll be common rules around who can be a partner, how partners are assessed, and what kind of behavioral and KPIs are required of partners within the business. So there's a different degrees of integration depending on which variant or limited company by guarantee you have. And then you have the fully integrated model where you effectively combine into a single legal entity. So if you are a UK firm, you might have go and acquire a firm in the European jurisdiction, and your UK LLP, for example, owns a direct interest in that overseas jurisdiction entity. And those partners in that overseas jurisdiction are also partners in your UK LLP. And that kind of model is a fully integrated one. It can be the most trickiest to do because it presents often the most issues around tax and regulation, which is why often, even where the intent is to be more integrated, it could be because of those tax issues and those regulatory issues that it's impossible to do or nearly impossible to do. And in those kind of cases, firms may just opt to go for an entity-based model like the Swiss variant of the limited company by guarantee.
Thanks, Zulon. Yeah, you're quite right to point out some of the challenges that firms wrangle with, and tax and regulation are always up there. I wonder, I'd love to come to Steve in a minute to talk about sort of structures that are useful in the US in a moment, but just before we do, Devika, I wonder if you could just comment briefly on the point that Zulon makes there about regulation. To what extent is it possible, if we can put it that way, for non-US lawyers to actually have a stake in or influence over a US law firm?
It is possible, but I think we have to be mindful that in the US, there's a mosaic of rules governing attorneys and law firms. And there are jurisdictions that do not permit non-lawyer investment or ownership in law firms. And then there are those that do. And then there is some emerging set of states that are beginning to look at these structures and say, well, maybe we will. So it's all over the place right now. And so, where the law firm is headquartered, where the lawyers are practicing becomes a big issue in terms of alternate business structures and how they might structure these with a UK firm.
So Steve, it would be really interesting to hear from you in terms of the structures that work well from a US perspective, what works well for the US lawyers and the US firms, and then we can sort of come on in a minute to sort of trying to put the two systems together, if you will.
Sure. There's a lot of expertise that come to play here. So for instance, someone like Devika, who's an expert in ethical issues, and I deal with tax issues and corporate issues. And so from a corporate standpoint, it's helpful to understand how the rules work so you can look at your alternatives and then pick which one might be the more appropriate alternative for a particular situation. In the US, and I think Zulon mentioned this, is that the more consolidated structure you have, that raises tax issues. So if you have flow-through entities from the US, that the income is flowing through to the UK mothership, if you will, then there's a slew of issues that come up. There's withholding issues that are triggered even though there's no distributions, just withholding of profits. So typically what will happen is you'll have the US set up a US corporation that serves as a blocker of income. So then it kind of gets away from the integrated structure that Zulon was talking about. And then it makes it tricky of, well, how do you, if you have two offices working on the same matter, how do you arrange billing and how are fees shared that way, or how are referral fees shared? You solve the tax issue, but then you have, some of these other issues that come up. And I think that's really the the big problem that we see from our perspective, and the blocker works well for tax, but maybe not for other issues. And as far as things like culture, you mentioned that's an issue as well. That's probably handled by even yet a different expert, somebody who's not necessarily a legal expert, but more of a integration expert.
I love that. Can you imagine your job title being expert on culture? That's a big call, isn't it? I think that's right. I mean, what would be really interesting, Zulon and Steve, is to explore in brief a couple of those sort of sticking points, if you like. Obviously, there's a huge appetite for those sort of global combinations across the world, and it would be interesting to hear some of the areas where a bit more thought is needed to make those international combinations successful. I don't know, Zulon, whether you want to kick us off on something that you've seen.
With kind of transatlantic combinations, especially, it goes back to my first kind of point that I made around strategy. What are the two firms trying to achieve by combining? Does 2 + 2 result in 5? Because ultimately that's what you're trying to do, isn't it? Create something of greater value of its whole than its parts. And when you're trying to do that, the key issues that both firms on either side will be looking at are firstly around culture, which Steve mentioned. It's really important, and diverging culture and firms that diverge in culture are rarely going to be successful merger partners. So finding a firm that has a similar culture to you will be important, because otherwise it can all go wrong, as we've seen in some examples in the past. And linked with that is around profit sharing, and often those two are closely related, because often the way you reward partners can feed into the culture of the firm and vice versa. And ensuring that the two firms have similarities, at least in some respects, around how they remunerate their partners, it will be quite important, and will feed into that culture piece as well. I've never seen two firms, one being Eat What You Kill, merging with a lockstep firm with much success. So you have to be able to meet somewhere in the middle. And lastly, the other kind of point I wanted to make was around around the objective, what the objective is around the firm in merging. Will you be able to meet those objectives if you are only fully integrated? Because if you want to be fully integrated, that causes its own issues on the tax side, as I've mentioned before, especially with UK and US firms having different accounting methods. So UK firms usually have the accrual basis of accounting versus US firms with cash basis of accounting. So if you want to create a fully integrated firm on day one with a single method of accounting, that can trigger potentially a big tax liability. So you have to think about that right from the outset. And if you are willing to take the hit, you have to also figure out between you and your merger partner as to how you're going to kind of divide that liability between you.
As Zulon mentioned, as you integrate US firm with the UK firm, and assuming that the UK is the parent, the US rules are much more relaxed around whether to choose cash or accrual method, and most prefer the cash unless they're required to go on accrual. And there's a lot of exceptions to accrual, generally speaking, and there's a lot of exceptions. A partnership does not have to go on the accrual method unless it has a C corporation or a corporate partner. And then there's exceptions for, again, generally speaking, if your gross receipts are less than 25 million, and then there's exceptions for personal or professional service corporations. So that's a lot of technical speak to say US much more favorable for cash method taxpayers. And then if you combine the two, and it's just a timing difference, as accountants will say, that all of a sudden you might have acceleration of income in the UK that might be unexpected and not necessarily appreciated.
I think tax, generally speaking, isn't appreciated. That's a fair that's a fair comment. And Devika, I wondered whether just before we draw to a close, you might be able to just comment on some of the kind of I suppose you call them kind of knock-on regulatory issues that can follow from structuring choices that you make when you're sort of thinking about combinations.
But I think conflicts is one of the biggest concerns for any firms that are beginning to speak. And they want to very early on look at where they may stand in terms of any combination that would involve their clients, their adversaries, and how that could potentially work. So the checking process, this is a lot about process, but it's also a lot about substance, because no two firms want to find out after a merger that many of their partners on both sides are not going to be able to continue to serve certain clients. So those are issues that they should be looking at very early on. Those are complicated issues. They require, especially in these cross-border types of combinations, they require a lot of careful analysis, reviewing, numerous conflict search reports, seeking approvals, walking through how to resolve them, if waivers are needed, if walls need to be set up. So it is a very major piece of any plan to combine. There are certainly other considerations as well when it comes to looking at a combination, aside from some of the things that have been discussed on the regulatory front. One of them we've already talked about, which is alternate business structures. And I think also looking at the different rules, the UK rules, the UK guidance, the rules in the US, in the jurisdictions that they're in, to make sure that there aren't other potential sticking points that they have not looked at that may come into play.
Thank you, Devika. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the UK regulator, the SRA, is very, very hot on conflicts checking, and is very firm that there is no exception to the client confidentiality principles to allow checking for conflicts in advance of, for example, mergers. So that adds a complication from a US perspective to the process. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to come to each of you, if I may, for your one top tip or your key consideration when thinking about transatlantic mergers. Can I come to you first, Devika?
I think I'm going to repeat what I just said, because it cannot be repeated enough, and that is check for conflicts.
Steve?
Oh, that's an easy one for me. Would be considering how the taxation impacts both sides and profit sharing.
And finally, Zulon.
I would go to kind of having in your mind, if you're looking at a potential merger, having understood what your own red lines are, so that you don't waste a lot of time talking to people when they're never going to be able to kind of meet what your kind of baseline is for a merger going forward. So you don't waste too much time speaking to a firm that's completely not aligned with your culture or your compensation, for example.
Thank you, Zulon. Wise words from you all. Thank you very much. And thank you also for joining us for this episode in our Practice Across the Pond series. We look forward to welcoming you at the next one. Thank you.